The galaxy was at war. Humanity, a young and rising power, stood caught between two ancient and ruthless empires, the brutal Krell Dominion and the hive-like Exarcha Collective. For decades, humans had avoided being dragged into their endless conflict, but now humanity's expanding territories made neutrality impossible. The Krall wanted Earth as their latest conquest, while the Exarcha saw humanity as a future threat to their hive's dominance. Lieutenant Commander Elias Kane was chosen for a dangerous mission. He wasn't a typical soldier. Kane was known for his sharp mind and unorthodox strategies, often bending the rules to get results. His superiors trusted him to lead a diplomatic mission to the Krall, negotiating a temporary ceasefire so humanity could strengthen its defenses. However, Kane secretly believed neither side could be trusted. To him, the Krall were bloodthirsty barbarians, and Exarcha were mindless drones controlled by a single, emotionless queen. Kane's diplomatic convoy arrived at a barren, war-torn moon near Krall territory. The meeting seemed to begin smoothly. The Krall commanders, towering and heavily armed, listened to Kane's proposal with cold calculation. But then the unthinkable happened. Without warning, Exarcha forces launched a surprise ambush, their sleek, insect-like ships tearing through both human and Krall vessels. The fragile peace talks turned into chaos. Elias Kane's instincts kicked in as explosions rocked the surface of the moon. "Retreat. Get the ships in the air," he shouted into his communicator. But it was too late. The Exarcha drones descended from the skies like a swarm of locusts, cutting through the battlefield. Kane's ship was struck by a blast, forcing him to eject. His escape pod plummeted to the moon's surface, crashing far from the conflict. Dazed but alive, Kane crawled out of the wreckage. Around him, the barren landscape stretched endlessly under a dim, eerie sky. He had no idea if anyone else had survived. His radio was dead, and his supplies were limited. Kane cursed under his breath. "This is just great," he muttered, pulling the survival kit from the pod. As he scanned the horizon for shelter, a strange sensation prickled the back of his neck. He turned, and his heart nearly stopped. A massive figure loomed behind him, tall, alien, and unmistakably Exarcha. Her gleaming carapace shimmered in shades of deep purple and black, and her glowing yellow eyes seemed to pierce straight through him. This was no ordinary drone. It was her, Queen Vaisha. Kane froze, gripping his pistol. He had heard legends of the Exarcha Queen, a creature of unparalleled intelligence who controlled her hive with a thought. But seeing her in person was something else entirely. She radiated power and danger, but something about her gaze felt different. Was it curiosity? Vaisha tilted her head slightly, as if assessing the human before her. For a moment, neither moved. Then the ground rumbled. Both turned to see a pack of Krall warriors closing in, their growls echoing through the air. The queen let out a sharp clicking sound, but her drones didn't respond. They were too far from her hive. She was vulnerable, just like Kane. Their survival depended on one thing: working together. "You've got to be kidding me," Kane muttered, lowering his pistol. "Guess we're on the same side now." The queen said nothing, but her stance shifted as if agreeing. Together, the human and the alien monarch prepared to face their enemies. The silence between Elias Kane and Queen Vaisha was heavy as the rumbling of approaching Krall warriors grew louder. Kane gripped his makeshift blade tightly, his pistol long since depleted of ammunition. The queen, standing tall with her glowing yellow eyes fixed on the distant threat, emitted a low clicking sound, a language alien to him, but filled with purpose. Kane's instincts screamed at him to run, but there was no cover and no escape. "All right, big lady," he muttered, glancing at her towering frame. "I don't know if you understand me, but unless you've got a hidden army, we're going to need a miracle." To his surprise, the queen shifted her head slightly, her gaze narrowing at him, as though she had understood something in his tone. She moved with deliberate grace, tapping one clawed hand against the ground. Kane realized she was drawing something in the dust. patterns, symbols. You're trying to communicate, he guessed, stepping closer. But there was no time to decipher her intentions. The Krull warband was now visible, a group of towering, muscular brutes clad in jagged armor, carrying weapons that crackled with deadly energy. Kane gritted his teeth. "Forget the plan. We'll just wing it," he muttered. He grabbed a jagged shard of metal from the wreckage and squared his shoulders. "I distract. You do whatever it is you do." Without waiting for a response, he charged forward with a roar, drawing the Krell's attention. The warriors barked in laughter, clearly amused by a lone human wielding scrap. One swung a massive blade, aiming to crush him. Kane ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the strike. Before the Krull could regroup, Vaisha leaped into action. With a speed and ferocity that belied her size, she slashed through the nearest warrior with her razor-sharp claws. A high-pitched shriek filled the air as her blows landed with brutal precision. Kane was momentarily stunned. She was fast, too fast. But the Krull were not easily defeated. Their leader, a towering brute with a cybernetic arm, roared orders in their guttural language. The remaining warriors regrouped, surrounding Kane and Vaisha. Kane's mind raced. Outnumbered and outgunned, their survival hinged on more than brute strength. He scanned the battlefield and spotted a damaged Krull transport vehicle nearby, its energy core sparking faintly. An idea formed. "Hey!" Kane shouted, hoping to grab Vaisha's attention. He mimed throwing something, pointing to the transport. The Queen's glowing eyes followed his gesture, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if she'd understood. But then she moved, faster than he expected, diving into the fray with surgical precision. While Vaisha engaged the Krull, Kane sprinted toward the transport. Sliding under the wreckage, he tore open a maintenance panel and yanked out sparking wires. Come on," he muttered, rigging the core to overload. The improvised bomb would give them a fighting chance, if he could time it right. "Vaisha," he yelled, unsure if she'd respond. She turned her head briefly, her expression unreadable, but her actions precise. She slashed her way free and darted toward him, her movements as fluid as they were terrifying. Kane detonated the core just as the Krull closed in. The explosion was deafening. Fire and shrapnel tore through the battlefield, sending the Krull flying. Kane hit the ground hard, shielding his head. When the dust settled, he looked up to find the Queen standing over him, her armored body barely scratched. "You're welcome," he muttered, coughing as he climbed to his feet. Vaisha tilted her head, studying him again. This time, her glowing eyes seemed to hold a spark of something more. Curiosity, perhaps. She crouched low, drawing new symbols in the dirt. Kane stared, trying to decipher the meaning. The symbols repeated, forming patterns that began to make a strange kind of sense. "You want to plan," he guessed, his voice uncertain. She tapped the ground twice, a gesture that felt like confirmation. Kane rubbed his temples. "All right, let's try this. If we're stuck together, we need a way to talk." He grabbed a nearby stick and drew crude pictures next to her symbols. Two figures, one small and one large, fighting off a group of enemies. Vaisha paused, then drew a single symbol below the picture, a circle with lines radiating outward. Kane didn't understand its full meaning but nodded anyway. It felt like progress. As night fell, Kane and Vaisha moved cautiously through the barren terrain. Their uneasy partnership had bought them time, but Kane knew more challenges lay ahead. He still didn't trust her. How could he? She was the queen of a hive species that had likely killed thousands of humans. But something about her was different. She wasn't the cold, unthinking tyrant he had imagined. There was intelligence in her actions, a strange blend of logic and instinct. Kane couldn't shake the feeling that she was observing him just as much as he was observing her. For now, they were united by necessity. Kane glanced at the alien queen as they marched through the darkness. "Let's just hope you're as smart as you look," he muttered under his breath. Vaisha didn't respond, but for a brief moment, He thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her glowing eyes. The barren moon stretched endlessly before them, its jagged terrain illuminated by the faint glow of distant stars. Cain trudged forward, his boots crunching against the gritty soil, while Vaisha followed silently. Her towering presence was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. They had survived the crawl ambush, but Cain knew they were far from safe. "How's it feel to be stranded, Your Majesty?" Cain muttered under his breath, not expecting a response. To his surprise, Vaisha tilted her head slightly, her glowing eyes narrowing as if to study him. "You can hear me, can't you?" he said, stopping to face her. She didn't react with aggression, only continuing to observe him. Her intelligence was undeniable, but her silence made her intentions a mystery. Cain sighed and shook his head. "Great. A walking puzzle that might kill me." As they pressed on, the terrain grew harsher, forcing them to climb jagged cliffs and navigate treacherous ravines. Cain marveled at Vaisha's movements. Her long, armored limbs seemed built for such challenges, while he had to rely on sheer human determination and grit to keep up. Hours passed, and their surroundings began to change. They stumbled upon what appeared to be ancient ruins, partially buried beneath layers of dust and debris. Massive pillars, etched with alien symbols, jutted out of the ground like skeletal remains of a forgotten civilization. Cain knelt beside one of the carvings, brushing away dirt with his hand. "What is this place?" he muttered. The symbols were unlike anything he had seen, though some patterns reminded him of the markings Vaisha had drawn earlier. Behind him, Vaisha let out a series of sharp clicks, her first deliberate sound since their battle with the crawl. Cain turned to see her standing before a massive doorway embedded in the cliffside. She placed one clawed hand on the surface, and the door began to hum faintly. "You know what this is, don't you?" Cain asked, walking toward her. Vaisha didn't acknowledge him directly, but her focus on the door was absolute. The humming grew louder as the door began to part, revealing a dark passageway leading deep into the moon's core. Cain hesitated, instinctively gripping his blade. "This looks like a bad idea," he muttered. Vaisha stepped forward without hesitation, her glowing eyes illuminating the path ahead. Cain had no choice but to follow. The air inside was cool and thick with the scent of age, as though the place had been untouched for centuries. As they ventured deeper, the walls of the tunnel came alive with faint, pulsating lights. Vaisha stopped suddenly, her posture rigid. She let out another series of clicks, this time lower and slower. Cain could feel her unease. "What's wrong?" he asked, even though he knew she wouldn't answer. He followed her gaze to the end of the tunnel, where a massive chamber opened up. In the center of the chamber was a monolithic structure, a towering obelisk that pulsed with an eerie golden light. Strange, spider-like machines skittered across its surface, maintaining its function. Cain felt a shiver run down his spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some abandoned ruin. Vaisha approached the obelisk slowly, her movements cautious. Cain noticed something different about her posture. She seemed hesitant, almost reverent. "This isn't just some relic, is it?" Cain asked, stepping closer. "It's something important to your hive." Vaisha didn't respond, but the way her claws lightly traced the surface of the obelisk told him he was right. Then it clicked in his mind. This was a Xarka artifact, ancient and powerful, the kind of thing that might explain why the Xarka had such advanced hive coordination. Cain felt the weight of realization settle on him. This could amplify your control, couldn't it? Let you command your entire hive, no matter where they are. Vaisha turned her head sharply toward him, her glowing eyes narrowing. Cain raised his hands defensively. "Hey, I'm not judging. Just trying to figure out if we're about to wake up something worse than the crawl." Before either of them could act, the chamber trembled violently. The obelisk's golden light intensified, and the spider-like machines scurried away into the shadows. Cain barely managed to keep his footing as cracks formed in the ground. Vaisha let out a sharp, commanding click, and Cain didn't need a translator to understand. "Run." They bolted back through the tunnel as the chamber began to collapse. Kane cursed under his breath, narrowly avoiding falling debris. "You just had to touch the ancient alien tech, didn't you?" he shouted. When they finally stumbled out of the ruins and into the open air, the ground behind them gave way, swallowing the structure entirely. Kane collapsed onto the dirt, panting. Vaisha stood over him, her expression unreadable, but her posture tense. "That thing wasn't just a weapon," Kane said between breaths. "It was alive, wasn't it?" Vaisha didn't answer, but the faint hum of the ruins, now buried, echoed in the distance. Whatever they had found was more than either of them understood, and Kane had the sinking feeling it wasn't done with them yet. For now, they had escaped. But Kane couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were now tied to something far bigger than a simple war. The air was thick with tension as Kane and Vaisha made their way across the rugged landscape. The collapse of the ancient ruins had shaken them both, but there was no time to rest. The Krull warbands were still hunting them, and Kane knew the only way out of this alive was to keep moving. For the first time since their uneasy alliance began, he allowed himself to truly think about the situation. Vaisha, the queen of the Xarka collective, was an enigma. Powerful, intelligent, but also unpredictable. He had come to respect her, but he couldn't forget that she was still an alien queen, the ruler of a species that had wiped out countless human colonies without mercy. Could he truly trust her? Vaisha walked a few steps ahead of him, her glowing eyes scanning the horizon. Kane followed her gaze, wondering what she was thinking. She was different from the cold, calculating queen he had imagined. She had shown moments of vulnerability, hesitation even. But was that a weakness, or was it simply part of her strategy? The silence between them stretched on as they continued through the harsh terrain. Kane knew they needed a plan to survive the Krull attack that was surely coming. But as much as he wanted to believe in Vaisha's potential to bring about peace, something inside him kept whispering that he was making a mistake by trusting her. It wasn't long before his doubts became a reality. The first sign came when they reached a small hidden valley where they could rest and regroup. Kane set up a small campfire, trying to gather his thoughts, but Vaisha stayed distant, her back turned to him. The glowing light from her eyes was the only thing that illuminated the darkness. As the night wore on, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He stood up and approached her cautiously. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "What's going on?" Vaisha didn't turn to face him. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice laced with a cold edge that sent a shiver down Kane's spine. "You should have known from the beginning, human. You are not the first to think they could change the fate of the galaxy." Kane's heart raced. He had a bad feeling about where this conversation was headed. "What are you talking about?" She finally turned to him, her glowing eyes locking onto his with a chilling intensity. "The relic. It was never just a tool to help us escape the Krull. It was a means to control them, to force their submission. And you, human, are my key to unlocking that power." Kane took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "You've been playing me all along." Vaisha didn't flinch, not playing. Using. You were always a means to an end. Your species may have a talent for diplomacy, but it is your will that I need. You've shown me how humans can be so persuasive. The weight of her words hit Kane like a punch to the gut. He had believed in their partnership, in the fragile trust they had built. But now it seemed like it was all a lie. "You've been lying to me." Kane's voice was sharp, filled with a mix of anger and betrayal. "This whole time, you've been using me to manipulate your own people." Vaisha's expression didn't change. "Manipulation is a human word. I see it as evolution. My collective needs a new path, one that doesn't require the stagnation of mindless obedience. With you, I can lead them to greatness." Kane's mind raced. He had been too focused on surviving the Krull and hadn't considered the bigger picture. He had let himself believe that Vaisha could change, that she could see beyond her hive mentality. But now, it was clear. She had used him all along. "You're insane," Cain muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "You think you can control the Krull, force them into submission. You're no different from them." Vaisha stepped closer, her towering form casting a long shadow over him. "You underestimate me, human. You do not understand the power of the relic. With it, I will bring order to the galaxy. The Krull will bend to my will, and I will unite the stars under my rule." Cain's hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let her do this, not just for humanity's sake, but for the galaxy as a whole. He had trusted her, but now it was clear that Vaisha was just as dangerous as the Krull, if not more so. "You can't control the galaxy with fear and domination," Cain said, his voice steady despite the anger boiling inside him. "You're just like the Krull, and if you think I'm going to help you destroy everything I fought for, you're dead wrong." Vaisha's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then, to Cain's surprise, she stepped back and raised her hands, as if to surrender. "I do not need you to help me, human," she said quietly. "I need you to understand. You have seen what the galaxy is: chaos, destruction, war. I offer a chance to change that. I offer you power." Cain shook his head. "I don't need your power, Vaisha. What I need is for you to choose a better way. A way that doesn't involve ruling through fear." Vaisha's gaze softened for the briefest moment, but the flicker of doubt was gone as quickly as it came. She turned away from him, her mind already shifting back to her plan. "I will not change, human. But I can offer you a choice," she said, her voice cold once more. "Join me, and we will reshape the galaxy together. Or stand against me and watch it burn." Cain stared at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision before him. He had hoped, no, believed, that there was a way to save her, but now he saw the truth. There was no saving Vaisha. She had already chosen her path. And so, Cain made his choice. He would stop her, no matter what it took. The cold wind howled through the desolate landscape as Cain stood his ground, staring at Vaisha. His heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. She had made her choice. Now he had to make his. Vaisha turned her back to him, her tall form casting an imposing shadow against the darkening sky. "You will regret opposing me, human," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "But you will understand in time. You will see that I am the future." Cain clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He knew he couldn't let her win, but the enormity of what was at stake weighed on him. Vaisha wasn't just some alien queen. She was the leader of a powerful species, a force that had the potential to crush entire civilizations. If she succeeded in her plan, humanity might be doomed. "I won't let you destroy everything we've worked for," Cain said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "The galaxy deserves more than your rule. It deserves freedom." Vaisha's eyes narrowed. She turned slowly, her expression a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "Freedom," she echoed, her tone mocking. "Freedom is chaos. It is weakness. My hive does not need freedom. It needs unity, control, and power. The Krull will bend to me, and they will know their place." Cain's blood ran cold at her words. She was beyond reasoning, consumed by her belief that her way was the only way. She was no better than the Krull, the very creatures she despised. "You're blind if you think the galaxy will bend to your will," Cain said, shaking his head. "People aren't just mindless drones. They fight for what's right, for their freedom. And I'll fight to make sure you never get the chance to impose your vision on them." For a moment, there was silence between them. The tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Cain felt a flicker of doubt in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had to do this. The stakes were too high. Vaisha's lips curled into a cruel smile. "So be it, human," she said. "You will fight. But know this, I will crush you, just as I will crush anyone who stands in my way." With a flick of her clawed hand, she summoned a swarm of drones from the shadows. They scuttled toward her, sleek and deadly, their sharp limbs clicking as they moved in unison. Kane's heart skipped a beat. He had seen the drones in action before, small, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. They were an army unto themselves. Kane's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. These drones were too fast, too numerous. He needed something more. As the drones closed in, Kane's mind raced. He couldn't take them all on at once, but maybe he didn't have to. There was a way to outsmart them, a way to use the environment to his advantage. Kane ducked behind a large rock formation, his mind calculating his next move. He had to draw them in, get them close enough to create a distraction. Vaisha wasn't paying attention to him anymore. She was focused on the drones and the power they would bring. He sprinted to the side, picking up a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage nearby. He threw it, causing a loud clang as it hit the ground, the sound echoing across the valley. The drones immediately turned in his direction, their sharp mandibles clicking as they zeroed in on the noise. Kane didn't hesitate. He dove into the shadows, using the cover to move quickly and silently. He climbed higher, moving to a vantage point where he could see the swarm below. His heart raced, but his focus never wavered. Vaisha was still distracted, her attention divided between controlling the drones and keeping an eye on him. She was so sure of her victory, so certain that Kane had no chance, but she underestimated him. Kane took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and fired. The shot rang out, hitting one of the drones square in the center of its metallic body. It exploded in a shower of sparks, sending the others into a frenzy. The swarm scattered, trying to regroup, but the chaos was exactly what Kane needed. He took advantage of the confusion, darting from cover to cover, picking off drones one by one. Each shot was calculated, each movement deliberate. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the future. Vaisha's eyes snapped toward him, her fury evident. She raised one hand, and the remaining drones surged toward him, faster now, more organized. But Kane was ready. He sprinted toward the edge of the valley, drawing the drones into a narrow passage between two cliffs. The drones, unable to adjust their formation in time, followed him straight into the trap. Kane hit a switch on the device he had rigged earlier, an explosive charge he had planted in the ground when he first scoped the area. The explosion was deafening, sending a shockwave through the valley. Rocks and debris rained down, burying the drones in the rubble. For a moment, there was silence. Kane stood, panting heavily, sweat dripping down his face. He had done it. He had beaten them, at least for now. The drones were destroyed, and Vaisha's plan had been delayed. But he knew this was far from over. Vaisha would not be easily deterred. He turned to face her, his eyes locked on hers. The distance between them felt like an eternity. "This isn't over, Kane," she said, her voice colder than ever. "You may have won today, but you will never stop me." Kane stood tall, refusing to show fear. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice steady. Vaisha's eyes glowed with hatred, but Kane didn't flinch. He had made his choice. He was ready for whatever came next. The battle for the galaxy was only just beginning. The harsh wind cut through the valley as Kane steadied his breathing. The explosion had created a temporary lull, but he knew better than to think he was safe. Vaisha wasn't the type to back down after losing a few drones. No, she would have something else planned. Kane wiped sweat from his forehead, his mind already racing through his options. He needed to keep moving, get back to human forces before it was too late. He couldn't let Vaisha's twisted vision spread across the galaxy. He turned toward the hills surrounding the valley, hoping to find cover in the rocky terrain. But as he moved, a low hum vibrated through the ground. It was a sound he didn't recognize, but it was enough to make him pause. "Not good," Kane muttered under his breath. Before he could react, the earth trembled beneath his feet. A massive shadow loomed over him, and he instinctively ducked, rolling behind a boulder just as something heavy landed with a thundering crash. He peeked out from behind a rock and froze. A colossal warship had just touched down on the valley floor. Its metallic surface gleamed under the harsh light, and the size of it made Kane's stomach drop. He knew this wasn't just some standard Sarka transport. This was a warship, a symbol of Vaish's power, and it was far more advanced than any human technology. The ship's massive doors opened, and a squad of heavily armed Sarka soldiers marched out. Their armor glinted in the dim light, and their eyes were fixed in a cold, unblinking stare. Kane swallowed hard. These were not the same drones he had destroyed. These were elite warriors, trained for combat. They were relentless, and he was vastly outnumbered. Vaish's voice echoed over the comms in his helmet, sending a chill down his spine. "You've delayed the inevitable, human, but this is where your resistance ends. My army is here." Kane crouched lower, keeping himself hidden behind the rocks. His mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. He had to do something. He couldn't take on an entire army alone, but maybe, just maybe, he could disrupt their strategy. He looked around, searching for something, anything, that could give him an advantage. His gaze landed on the warship's engines, which were still glowing with power. A single shot to one of those could cause a massive explosion, but getting close enough to hit it would be nearly impossible without being detected. Then it hit him. The warship might be heavily armored, but it was also vulnerable in certain places. Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied the soldiers around the ship. He saw a few weak spots, places where the armor was thinner or where the soldiers' movements suggested an opening. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. Kane took a deep breath and prepared himself. He checked his ammo, making sure his sidearm was fully loaded. Then, without hesitation, he sprinted toward the far side of the valley, hoping to create enough distance to take a shot without being seen. The soldiers were focused on the ship, but their patrol patterns were predictable. Kane moved quickly, slipping behind rocks and boulders to stay out of sight. He knew the longer he waited, the more likely Vaish's would send reinforcements. Time was running out. He reached the edge of the valley, where a narrow passage led up into the hills. From there, he would have the perfect vantage point to strike. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his mind sharp. As he climbed the narrow path, Kane's thoughts kept returning to Vaish's. She had shown him glimpses of something more than just a conqueror. There had been moments when she hesitated, moments when her desire for power seemed almost secondary to a deeper need. But he couldn't afford to get lost in that now. She had made her choice, and it was clear that her vision for the galaxy would leave nothing but destruction in its wake. Kane reached the top of the hill, his breathing labored from the climb. Below, the Sarka soldiers were still patrolling, unaware of his presence. The warship loomed ahead, a giant that seemed to swallow the valley. He took a knee, steadying his rifle. He aimed carefully, looking for the weak point he had spotted earlier. The soldier nearest to the vulnerable section of the ship turned his back, and Kane saw his chance. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, piercing the silence of the valley. The soldier crumpled to the ground with a sharp cry. The reaction was immediate. The other soldiers spun around, their eyes scanning the landscape for the source of the shot. But Kane had already moved, disappearing into the rocks before they could pinpoint his location. He wasn't done yet. Kane moved again, quickly, this time targeting the exposed engine compartment of the warship. His rifle was powerful enough to make a dent in the thick metal, but he had to be precise. Another shot rang out, hitting the ship's engine with a sharp, echoing thud. The warship shuddered. The soldiers around the ship froze. Kane could see them trying to figure out what had just happened. But their confusion gave him the opening he needed. He took another shot, this time aimed at a fuel line running along the bottom of the ship. The shot hit its mark. There was a deafening explosion, and the warship's engines erupted in a massive fireball. The shockwave sent Kane tumbling backward, his ears ringing. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything. Then, as the dust began to settle, he stood up, wiping dirt from his face. He had done it. The warship was crippled. The soldiers were scrambling to regroup. But Cain knew this victory was only temporary. Vaishya would not give up so easily. He could hear the sound of reinforcements approaching in the distance. His time was running out. Cain knew one thing for certain. If he wanted to stop Vaishya, he would have to get to her before she unleashed the full power of her army. The clock was ticking, and there was no turning back now. The smoke from the explosion still hung thick in the air as Cain ran across the rocky terrain. His heart was racing, his muscles aching from the battle. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The destruction of the warship had given him a brief advantage, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to defeat Vaishya. She had too much power, too many soldiers. If he didn't act fast, everything would be lost. Cain's mind raced as he navigated the rugged landscape, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Vaishya's forces were regrouping. Her drones and soldiers were closing in, more organized now than before. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He had one chance, one final chance to stop her before her army overwhelmed him. Cain reached a cliff that overlooked a wide, open valley. The Kshatriya forces were marching in formation below, moving with deadly precision. Their leader was not far behind them. Vaishya herself, walking at the front of the line, her eyes scanning the terrain like a predator searching for its prey. Cain didn't hesitate. He dropped to a crouch, carefully aiming his rifle at the alien queen. He knew that a single shot could be the difference between victory and defeat, but taking her down would be no easy task. Vaishya was surrounded by her elite soldiers, her personal guard, and they would fight to the death to protect her. For a moment, Cain considered retreating. He could fall back to a safer position, regroup with the human forces, and plan another attack. But deep down, he knew it would be pointless. Vaishya was too dangerous. As long as she lived, her ambition would continue to spread, and humanity would be at risk. There was no other option. Taking a deep breath, Cain steadied his rifle and lined up the shot. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, a voice rang out from behind him. "Don't even think about it, human." Cain's blood ran cold. He whipped around, his gun raised, but it was already too late. Vaishya stood there, her glowing eyes locked onto his, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I knew you would come for me," she said, her voice cold as ice. "But you are too late. My forces are already in position. You cannot win." Cain's grip on his rifle tightened, but he knew she was right. Her army was vast, and he was alone. For the first time in their entire conflict, he felt the weight of the situation. He had been fighting for survival, for the galaxy, for humanity. But now, staring into Vaishya's eyes, he realized the truth. He couldn't win this alone. Vaishya took a step forward, her presence dominating the landscape. "You've been brave, human. I'll give you that. But in the end, all your resistance is just a passing storm. I will reshape the galaxy. You'll see." Cain's mind was spinning. There had to be a way out of this. He couldn't let her win. Not like this. Suddenly, a thought struck him. He had learned from his past encounters with Vaishya. She was not just powerful. She was intelligent. She understood strategy, manipulation, and control. But Cain knew one thing about her. She was arrogant. She believed she was untouchable, unbeatable. And that was her greatest weakness. He couldn't beat her head-on, but maybe he didn't need to. Cain took a slow, deliberate step back, drawing her attention to his movements. "You're right," he said, his voice calm. "You've won. You've beaten me. But there's something you don't understand." Vaishya raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what is that, human?" Cain's eyes glinted with a sudden, daring idea. "The galaxy doesn't bow to anyone, not even you." Before Vaishya could react, Cain pressed a hidden button on his wristband. The ground beneath them trembled, and a series of explosions erupted in the distance. Cain had planted charges across the valley when he first arrived, knowing that a distraction might be his only chance. The explosions created a massive diversion, sending the Kshatriya soldiers into a panic. Vaishya's eyes widened in disbelief. "You? But before she could finish her sentence, Cain dashed toward a nearby cliff, using the smoke and chaos as cover. He had to make it to the communications relay he had hidden earlier. If he could activate it, he might be able to send a signal to the human fleet and call for reinforcements. Vaishya's soldiers scrambled to regain control of the situation, but Cain's strategy had worked. For the first time, Vaishya's confidence wavered. Cain reached the relay, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He quickly input the sequence he had memorized and activated the device. A burst of static filled his ears before a voice came through. "Cain, we're here. What's your status?" It was Captain Anders. Cain's heart leaped with hope. "I need backup. Now. Vaishya's forces are closing in. We're on our way. Hold your position. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Cain didn't have 10 minutes. He could already hear Vaishya's voice in the distance, ordering her soldiers to hunt him down. He had to keep her distracted. "Get ready, Anders," Cain muttered to himself. "This is it." Cain turned to face Vaishya once again. She had broken through the smoke, her glowing eyes seething with fury. "I warned you, human," she growled. "You cannot stop me." "I've already won, Vaishya," Cain said, standing tall despite the danger. "Because no matter what happens, humanity never stops fighting." The sound of distant engines roared in the air. Human reinforcements were arriving. Vaishya's face twisted with rage as she realized the battle was slipping from her grasp. But Cain was ready. The final fight for the galaxy had begun.